So I'm just going to introduce our guest commission composer for this year, 2014-15 school year. Mark Applebaum is the professor of music composition at Stanford, and he beseeched me to tell you the fictional fact that he's released his own line of glasses in Canada. Welcome, Mark Applebaum.
Well, what do you think? What do you want to see today is really the question, right? Hammers. Hammers, you want to see hammers? Hammers, yeah. All right, well, let's leave it like this.
All right.
Thank you, Derek, for that introduction. Thank you, Patty and Pat, for having me out. It's really exciting and a delight to be here. And I'm looking forward to, well, if I make it through this hour and I'm still invited to continue to do things in the next couple of days, I'm really looking forward to those things. This is my talk today. I've decided to title it Moral Perils in the Embrace and Rejection of Extant Culture, which may be the first sign that I've gravely misunderstood my audience and completely inappropriate. And I should also point out that I've seen just a little bit of the campus so far, and it's really, it's nice, and all the people are nice here. I have one complaint, there's no evidence of a river or falls yet, so I'm hoping that might be cleared up later. Do any of these things exist still?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. All right, well, maybe during my visit we'll remedy that. But the agenda for this hour is, I was going to do a jazz piano performance, but since there's not an instrument here, we'll have to kind of imagine that. Or maybe I'll show you some footage from an extant jazz piano performance. And then I want to share some examples of my work, and then I'd like to reveal a crisis towards the end. Okay, so that's what I hope to do. And here are some hammers. So the improvising is something that I like to do, and I mostly do that at the piano. And let me see if I can find some footage of, there. Just to give you a little taste of a sort of approach to jazz piano, and you can get more than a taste tonight at 7:30 in the concert hall. My father, Bob Applebaum, is here with me, and we're going to play a concert this evening of our jazz piano duo, which will feature a lot of improvisation on jazz standards and some original tunes in a two-piano setting. So you get to hear two beautiful Steinway D instruments that we promise to leave in good condition for them. So here is a little example of a trio that I played some time ago. Here's a piece called 9 Lives. Okay, let me pull this back a little. See if that works. Okay, so here's just a little bit of an example of some of the jazz playing I like to do. And how it intersects with one particular instrument that's part of my musical cosmology. And that is the first instrument that I allegedly learned how to play at the piano. But this guy tells me, when I say this guy, let's go back here, this guy tells me that I need to have an instrument change and tell you about another instrument that I play. And that's a series of instruments that I've been building, original instruments. The first one was the mousetrap, and it's a tabletop size sort of thing built with junk and hardware and found objects mounted on these electroacoustic soundboards. They're sort of electroacoustic percussion boards. And I play them with chopsticks and wind-up toys and violin bows and knitting needles and plectra and so forth. And here's a picture of, in the early 90s, dragging the mousetrap to Darmstadt, Germany. And a close-up, you see the corrugated, copper piping and gas tubing, and you see those are quarter-inch threaded rods that are vertical. I don't know if you can see some springs in the distance here that are stretched, different gauges, different lengths. We have door stops. We've got AstroTurf, all sorts of different things that are connected to these instruments. And this is another one, the Mini Mouse. This is a small instrument that I can set on the desk of a piano and play old and new instruments together. A close-up of a duplex mouse phone, another instrument I built. All of my combs, by the way, are permanently affixed to my sound sculptures. The Mini Mouse is an instrument that has a 5-pin DIN jack. I don't know if you can see this here, like a MIDI jack. It's not attached to anything in the back. It's just there as kind of a sarcastic comment on the optimism of electronic music. There's the Mini Mouse. When I was living in Copenhagen, I used welding torch to sort of bend this bronze brazing rod into these weird shapes. They make incredibly extraordinary sounds when struck or bowed. I call them tam trees. They have kind of like an in-between a gong and tam-tam-like kind of quality. Here's a bird's eye view of the mousetrap surface. You can see the 100 yen store Hello Kitty chopsticks from Tokyo, different wheels and so forth, more combs. These are electric guitar strings stretched through pulleys and turnbuckles, so I can tune them in different ways. And here's the most recent instrument. This is the Mousketeer, and that's T-I-E-R. It's on sort of 3 levels. This was a smart instrument in a number of ways that I'll mention, but one thing is just a totally pragmatic one. I designed the case first based on the maximum airline baggage dimensions. So I finally got smart about that. And this sets up and takes down much more rapidly than any of my other instruments. A side view, you see the toilet tank flotation bulb in the upper right, the push and pull thunder sheets, aka like door signs. 2 squeaky wheels. You know, I had this I had to go to 11 hardware stores in the San Francisco Bay Area to find sufficiently squeaky wheels, and I have this ongoing nightmare about a do-gooder stagehand with a bottle of WD-40 who's I can fix that for you. We have a stack of belts. Here's some nails pounded at different gauges and lengths of nails. In a live setup, I connected to a bunch of live electronics so that I can modify those sounds. So what we have is actually a completely acoustic instrument. That's on the right side. That's this thing. Okay. This is an acoustic instrument, and I'm usually the only person at the International Computer Music Conference that if the power goes off, I can still play the game. Although for an audience of about this size, not a full jazz odyssey in front of a festival crowd, of course, but something more intimate. But it's meant to be amplified, and it is. So I have these surplus 50-cent contact pickups, really cheap things, that pick up the vibrations that run through the soundboards, and then I amplify that. So in that regard, it becomes an electroacoustic instrument with this kind of, quote, straight amplification. But then with the electronics, I can add reverberation and delay and all sorts of pitch effects and do looping and stuff live. So then it becomes an electronic instrument with the imposition or the mediation of basically, computer circuitry. I don't have the instrument here with me, but I can play you a little sample. So this is what that nail, you see the yellow arrow, plucking, let's hear what this nail sounds like when plucked. It sounds like this. Yeah, that's it. It's short. You want to hear it again?
Yep.
I thought you would. It was quieter that time, I'm not sure why. Let's hear that same nail plucked again, but with some signal processing, some of the electronics. Oops, I missed that. Or aim. So that was just one pluck. But because I had a bunch of electronic gadgetry set in a particular manner, it produced that sound. Let's hear that same pluck with the settings on my gadgetry in another position. Okay, one physical articulation, but this sort of this whole sort of pattern or this sort of tumbling sort of effect of these different kinds of things. So based on, the point is that the nail sounds a certain way when plucked, but it can sound an infinite number of ways based on all sorts of settings that I can dial up live on the fly. So I can choose if I want to have the, quote, pure sound of the plucked nail or a more modified sound. Here's the sound, same nail but bowed. I don't know if you can even see there's like rosin left over from the bow on the nail. So there we have the nail bowed. And here's what it sounds like modified with some live electronics. So, where I'm going with this, but I'm going to play some more sounds. But where I'm going with this is that this, if you haven't figured it out, in some ways contrasts the piano. Okay, I don't know if that's too complicated for you, but I think there are some contrasts. But like, I can't live without that sound we just heard. Okay, I can't imagine a world without it. Nor can I imagine a world in which you can't stroke the nails with a chopstick like that, or modify that stroke thus. Here's the squeaky wheels, low and then high, and modify it. And I'll take my thumbs and sort of massage the teeth of the combs. And then here is modified. And now let me play you kind of a passage which put all those things together. So first, a plucked nail, the stroked nails, low and high squeaky wheels, and then the combs, the teeth of combs. Here's what that sounds like. And now let's hear what it sounds like with one type of electronic amplification. Are we getting anything out of this speaker? Does anyone know? Did you hear that? Let's try it. Let's try it again. Now it works. Okay, it's a special cable thing. Anyway, okay, well that gives you just a little introduction to this instrument, the Mousquetaire. And here's the thing that I want you to know about the Mousquetaire, or about me and the Mousquetaire, and that is that I'm the world's best Mousquetaire player. And now this may sound like an incredibly egocentric and narcissistic thing to say, and it is, I suppose. But the more important thing, at least to me, is that I hold another distinction, which is I'm also the world's worst Mousquetaire player. Okay? Now with the piano, I'm neither the world's best nor worst pianist. I'm somewhere in the middle of like a billion people, more or less. Okay? But with the Mousquetaire, which of course there's only one instrument, it almost could be thought of as a kind of a prototype of sorts, and there's only one player. Naturally, I'm both the best and the worst. And so this is actually the pleasure and danger of engaging in an artistic practice that you make up. There's only one of you, you're in a culture of one. And of course you can be gratified in a very sort of like, sort of ephemeral and meaningless way, I think, a very trivial way, by acknowledging that you're the best. But by acknowledging it that you're the worst, it's actually a more useful and artistically productive kind of state. Because if I'm the worst, by definition, I must be a beginner, I feel. And therefore, like, I have to ask questions about what would an intermediate state of the art be? And what would an advanced state of the art be? How could I get from one place to another? What is a good doorstop articulation? Would this way of massaging AstroTurf be better than this way? You know, how would we know? And so it's a sort of a lonely enterprise, but I'm trying to create a kind of, it's hermetic, it's personal, but I'm trying to create a kind of discourse that would ask the kind of questions or create a certain kind of context where I could move my skill level along and, in a sense, move this culture. I think of it as a culture, even though I'm alone in that. Does that make sense? So it's, you know, if you listen to a piano player or a clarinetist or a xylophone player or something, you can pretty much, if you participate broadly in that kind of culture in which that music exists, then you can kind of hear, like, okay, that's kind of a beginner, and that's sort of an advanced player or whatever, and you have an idea about what a timpanist would do to get from the state of being a beginner to an intermediate, and what a saxophonist would do from going from an intermediate to an advanced state of the art. You have roughly an idea of the kind of dedication, the kind of training, the kind of steps, the kind of education that you would undertake, and moreover, what the kind of questions you would ask. But with the Musketeer, again, like, what's good spring playing? And so this is something that I wrestle with, but I wrestle with it deliberately because I don't want to be in this sort of trivial state where I could show up with this instrument and I could just be like, I have one of these, and people go, wow, that's really cool, you made one of those. But you can't imagine like going on stage and saying, I have this clarinet. And everyone's like, bravo! You know, it's like, well, what can you do with it? What can you make us feel, and what can you make us think with that instrument? And so I'm trying to always push to think about, and this is especially important as, I think, as a teacher, and maybe doubly important as a teacher in Silicon Valley, where there's this like crazy kind of context for quote innovation and so forth. And so it's not enough for me that my students just simply make something new. We really want to ask questions about like, how can you move that new thing to a mature state of the art? Is that sort of, is this resonating with anyone? Okay, it's a dark room, I can't see any of you, so I don't know if you nodded or, no, I can't see you. I appreciate that. So anyway, so this instrument, by the way, is in fact the most recent instrument, but it's from 2001. And so what I did is, after building all these different instruments that I showed you during the 90s, I stopped building with this one because I finally realized the project is not to make new instruments. The project is to learn how to play this one instrument. And the sort of the coda to this little sort of soliloquy is that I now feel like maybe I'm an intermediate player. So that's kind of exciting. Okay. Anyway, that's the dangers of being best and worst. So staying with the idea of different instrumentation, we might find this piece as a kind of an example. And I don't want to play this in full for you because you're going to hear this tonight. Are you playing this, Derek?
On Saturday, yeah.
I'm sorry, it's not tonight. Jazz is tonight. This will be on Saturday. The setup for this is this table of all sorts of junk and doodads. So this is the instrumentation for this piece. Here's the opening of a performance by Brian DeBorder. So this goes on for sort of 4 hair-raising minutes, where this somewhat a person of questionable insanity but undoubted seeming purpose is like working through these things with extraordinary alacrity, these sort of weird goddess rituals that then have this electronic processing that are all different things that are about, there's 4 different types of actions that I've considered carefully here that have to do with combining transforming, materials that combine, materials that get transformed, materials that are broken and that are either like frangible, which is to say, you know, like breakable, or malleable, like deformable, and then you know, things that are separatable versus other things, and so forth. And it goes on, and I won't reveal the ending. Derek, did you have a question or a complaint, maybe?
Well, I mean, it's something to talk about. There's some things that he does in this performance I've watched. It's like 100,000 times.
Yeah.
And there's some things he does that are different than what's in the score.
Sure.
Like later on, he pulls everything out of a wooden box, and in the score you specify a container. So I was just curious about some of those things. And I know that, you know, it can be left up to choice, because you mentioned that in the score, but I was just curious if you had a hand in this performance, or...
I didn't have a hand in this performance, and I had never seen Brian do it before he made this video.
Okay.
But I do like his, you know, I don't know that I could create, I feel like I could say something now that could be taken as some sort of maxim about how Applebaum feels about the specificity of things in his score. And I don't want to do that, because I know that there might be one thing where, like, I don't really care what kind of drill you use, but maybe there's like another thing where I'm like very concerned about what kind of scissors you use. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know that I could create that thing. I will say that the composer of every period expects not exactitude. That's a mistake. We don't expect that from performers. What we expect is fidelity. And so the fidelity is an issue that has an ethical component to it, and it has to do with a performer engaging, in a sense, communing with the space that the piece provides. The composition provides a certain kind of cultural space. And the idea is that you want to be attuned to that, first of all, and try to understand and respect the hierarchy of values that are implied by that piece. And if you do that, then you're free to make your own decisions. To give another example of this, and this is no different, by the way, if it's Haydn or Zelda or whatever. So to give another example, sometimes if I write a piece and I say, Mike Balter, number 7, medium yarn mallet, blue mallets, or something like that. And then that's because that's what I was working with, that's what I was imagining and so forth. And then the player who fully understands, who feels that he or she fully understands what I'm trying to go for with that mallet, doesn't own those mallets. Does that mean like the piece is wrong by not doing that? So maybe the expression should have been to say something in the score that was about my intention, and you figure out what mallets to use. Otherwise, you could like have a situation where it's like, okay, well, I'm playing this piece in this enormous reverberant hall. I don't think the composer was imagining that. Or I'm playing this piece in this very, very dry space with lots of people absorbing, you know, and lots of, you know, fabric. The point is that I think that the issue of fidelity hopefully will give some sort of agency to a performer to make deviations. So if your container or his wooden box order is in the spirit of the piece, then I think you're actually communing in a sense that I expect and I appreciate. That was a very elaborate and maybe... I answered a question you didn't ask. I'm good at that. Okay. Another unusual approach to instrumentation might be my concerto for florist and orchestra. Let's watch just a little clip, a few clips from this. There's the orchestra. You may recognize some of those instruments. But then you have the florist who's doing his thing. This is actually from the third movement. A clip here now from the first movement. And then the second movement. So again, for most people, that's a kind of an unusual instrumentation, as would be this piece, which will be presented on Saturday night, tuned for 3 conductors and no players. Here's a little clip from the first time it was done. That's Phil Larson.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's a piece that was based on the observation, let's go back here, get a little light in the room, of two people actually having a virulent argument in sign language that produced almost no decibels to speak of, but affectively, psychologically, was a very loud sort of experience. And so, on the basis of that, I started thinking about like what kinds of musical parameters can be expressed, you know, in the visual dimension rather than merely in the aural one. Notation is another, you know, well, notation is an element of music that preoccupies, I think, almost all composers. No, that's not true. If we take the world of all music, it actually preoccupies a subset of the composers. But the composers of my ilk, as it were, think about notation quite a bit. And my scores have evolved over the years. I do all of them by hand. This is a piece for 5 winds and 5 strings. Here's a piece for piano, a solo guitar piece. These are sort of conventional approaches to notation in the sense of the purpose of a notational specification. That is, that the composer, the responsible composer, as I was taught, imagines like some sort of sound object in his or her head and then creates a notational specification whose purpose is to be a guide or a provocation, a stimulus to an interpreter who's then going to realize that imagined sound object, and if the sound object that is heard resembles the sound objects that is imagined, then the notation is probably a good one. Okay, here's a piece for a chamber orchestra piece for 14 players. But like, you know, increasingly I've been interested in like certain kinds of indeterminate approaches in notation, performance indeterminacy, not aleatoric chance composition, but rather things that invite the performers to make decisions on the fly, change the local, or in advance, change the local morphology. Here's some circles that are these actual dials, these spinners that I've created, and you know, the players at that exact moment spin the spinners to tell them what the pitch will be on the next measure, for example. Okay, and then here's another moment of the piece. This measure here, 34, which is it's repeated x plus 1 times, where x is the number of times it takes 3 or more players to stand up and protest. So in a sense, you get this like moment where there's this potentially infinitely recursive kind of thing that is socially mediated, you know, and so as a consequence, the number of repetitions is, you know, falls from that. Esto is a piece where I took the Copenhagen subway system map and renamed all the stations to abstract musical provocations, and the players who are synchronized with stopwatches follow the timetables, which are listed in minutes past the hour. And then Medium, which is also going to be presented on Saturday night, is the first pictographic score that I composed, or completely pictographic score, where I've shirked the sort of responsibility that I was taught of imagining some sort of sounds and using notation to sort of convey that. Rather, this is almost a kind of a social project in which I was interested in what performers would do with these pictographs, which are completely undefined. I refuse to define them. So the performers respond to these, and they come up with their own assignation of musical actions and sounds to these pictographic elements. I'll slide pairs of pages to the left here, as it were, and you can see some of the score. These are made by hand with drafting templates, French curves, straight edges, and so forth. And some of these things are, you know, have very strong musical analogs to me that I can make explicit in a conversation or not, or just not reveal. And some of the things, there are elements that represent other, quote, real world or extra musical aspects. So now on this piece, by the way, this is a piece that does not invite improvisation. That's actually something I like to mention whenever I have the chance. I'm sort of like an evangelist about this next point, which is that I'm really tired of the notion that that there's this presumption among performers that if it's a non-standard notation, especially something that's like pictographic like this, then it equals improvisation. It does not. It does not have to, I should say. It might. You could improvise. You can improvise a response to a Beethoven score that is what we would call a standard common practice notation. You could sit down at the Beethoven score and you can decide the x-axis today is not time. And you can decide that right as you sit down. And you could say, I'm going to read it from bottom to top. That's how I'm going to read it. Or you could say, I could be sitting at the piano and looking at this Beethoven sonata, and I could see a nice F forte, right? And I could say, no, I just had this idea. F means pitch class F. So whenever I see F, I'm not going to play loud. I'm just going to play an F somewhere on the piano. Okay? That would not be a performance that would have fidelity to Beethoven. So I wouldn't suggest that, because we know that there is a common practice for how to interpret that notation. So I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm just saying you could. And conversely, you could look at this a month before the performance, and you could work out exactly what a diagonal means. And you could work out exactly what dark shaded areas mean. You could work out exactly what you think, you know, some sort of curved sinusoidal thing versus some rectilinear orthogonal kind of thing is. You could decide what that means. And you could decide that has to do with where I put my fingers. You could decide that has to do with which way I face the audience. You could decide that that's going to relate to pitch. And you could decide that that has to do with amplitude. You could decide all sorts of things. So, but you could do it in advance. And so this piece specifically forbids improvisation. This asks you to come up with your own, it's your system, not like the Beethoven, where we all agree F is forte. And we all agree that a shaded thing with this vertical thing we call a stem is a quarter note, and it gets one beat when the denominator of the meter is 4. We kind of agree that that's standard. You know what I'm saying? Looking at this yet another way about interpretation. If I do this, if I have a line that goes like this, and I ask players who are interested in engaging in this kind of thing, what does this mean? The first thing I hear all the time is like the pitch goes down. It's going to be a descending glissando. Okay, that's fine. First of all, they've said that the x-axis is time. We don't have to do that. Apparently they have. All right, so you could do that. But then they could say, then they get bored of that. They're like, okay, well, wait a second. Maybe let's just the density of information goes down, or like the orchestration is going to fade away. So maybe you're going to do that. And then we say, like, well, so they can come up with all sorts of things where this idea is descending. But this same thing, if read on a different axis, is this. So let's take the same thing, right? The same bit of ink that was this. I can rotate the page a little bit, and now we can read it like this. What's this? People say, like, oh, that's like a verticality of like the simultaneity of multiple things happening. And someone else says, no, that's something that's happening and it stops, and then a new condition happens after that. It's kind of a barrier, before and after. So now we're starting to think about different ways of doing this. Okay, so let's remember this then. We got this line here, right? Now let's take a different glyph. A circle. Goes around like this, right? So imagine a circle here. Well, what could we do with that? People are like, some people say like, oh, that implies some sort of looping. So we're going to play something and we're going to like continue to do it. Or we can go clockwise or counterclockwise around this thing, right? Some people do, or some circle that's inside or outside. Okay, we can think about that. Now what happens if we take the circle, okay? So imagine the circle is here, right? And you remember the vertical that we put aside? Let's attach the vertical here. Okay? It looks like a half note, right? So when you see a half note, when you play a half note, you go like, oh, first I go around the circle. Whenever I play a half note, I go around the circle a few times, and then when I get to the stem, I play a whole bunch of things simultaneously. Of course not. The half note, you imagine it's a kind of single gestalt, it's a single entity, and you recognize it in its entirety. So suddenly we've learned that magnification makes a difference too. Maybe this is one staccato articulation, this thing. This is one staccato articulation, and what would it be? So there's all of these kinds of issues that come into play when you deal with sort of pictographic notation. It invites that kind of breadth of thought. But I will say that this piece, again, and I realize this is now like, this digression has been like a 45-minute one. But anyway, I get a little high about this. This does not invite improvisation. Whereas this piece, the metaphysics of notation, invites improvisation or not. You can work it out in advance or not. Now this was a piece that was set up at the Cantor Art Center Museum for a year, and it was experienced as visual art all week long except Fridays between noon and 1. Various players came in, soloists, small ensembles, people with electronics, acoustic instrumentation, hybrids, some dancers interpreted the score, spoken word poets, like rappers did something with it, every week. And there were these panels between the pillars upstairs, and they were sandwiched between plexiglass. I spent about a year drawing this. This is 72 feet of notation split into 12 6-foot wide panels. And then players were not given any instruction other than they could play between noon and 1. Many of them used the whole hour. Some used just a small amount of it. Many of them seemed to play from left to right. Some didn't. Many of them played all 12 panels. Some of them just set up in front of one. I think I have a picture of my student Sam Adams, who's John Adams' son. There's Sam, who's my advisor at the time, who set up in front of one. He just played this one panel for the full hour. So you have these all sorts of different approaches to this. Now, because it was in a museum, there's our friend from UCSD, Jane Rigler. Because it was in a museum and some people were traveling from abroad and they were just showing up, I allowed improvisation. I might have allowed it anyway. I wasn't on a rant. and this piece, like I was with medium. But like, you know, so some people had improvised response. Other people who were local came and studied the score very carefully, made a plan in advance. Some people who were local, like the violinist Eric Ullman, was local but refused to look at it until the moment. He wanted to be led in backwards and placed in front of the first panel, and at noon he turned around and looked at it for the first time. And that was his thing. Burnt score fragments dangling in these mobiles and so forth. Now the thing is, here are 3 panels in the score. I don't know if you can sort of see this. There's a panel here for my hand above, and then one between my hands, and then there's this bottom. So we have 3 panels, one above the other. I don't know if you can see, but there's a kind of horizontal continuity where some lines turn into other things gradually or suddenly. Here you see this kind of like sinusoidal figure that's getting larger. The circles are getting larger, but they're also dematerializing. And then that dematerialized thing comes into focus here on the next panel. So if you were to imagine as it was presented in the museum, one panel, well then a pillar, and the next panel horizontally. In other words, if you took this middle panel and you put it off to the right, you would see that circular thing up here dematerializing and then coming into focus here, but here in this rectilinear orthogonal space of rectangles. So there's been a kind of a modulation of sorts. All right? And then similarly, things continue. But as I placed it here, I'm also wanting to show that it can be read vertically. So this descent of shields produces this final shield, which inverted over into the next panel becomes this one. These stalagmites and stalactites that dangle off of this sort of sloping line here, this one continues in this dimension. You have these little weird kind of hockey stick looking things here, this flower that inverts down here. So the piece can be read horizontally, but it can also be read vertically. And if you took the first panel and put it after the 12th in the horizontal dimension, the very first glyph and the very last, on the first panel, the very last glyph on the 12th are the same. So it suggests this like kind of potential infinite horizontal thing. If you took the 12th panel and you put it above the first panel, it also reads in the vertical dimension. So it loops in both vertical and horizontal dimensions, which mathematicians tell me is called a torus. And I like that. If we want to just do a zooming in, a close-up, you can see a little bit of the kind of detail. Now, continuing with this idea about notation, I've been making these pieces out of wristwatches. So I've been designing these custom wristwatches. This is the score. So the players have the score on their wrists, and they follow the second hand. And as the second hand passes over various glyphs, they respond accordingly. This is a piece called Wristwatch Geology for players tapping and rubbing stones together. And then here's a piece with International Phonetic Alphabet for singers, and another piece with variable information that was for the Meridian Arts Ensemble, and a piece called Wristwatch Rabbit Hole, and so forth. So you have a bunch of these different kinds of approaches. Now, all of these things, or pretty much all these things that I've been sharing with you, have involved like kind of performance indeterminacy, things that can be changed from performance to performance, so that they always sound different. This is contrasting with the time I spend writing determinate works, which makes up probably half of the Applebaum pie graph of activity. I spend a lot of time writing works with kind of very specific things that are intended to sound more or less the same way every time. One example of that would be this piece Aphasia for hand gestures synchronized to 2-channel audio. This is with a tape part or an audio part that's made up exclusively from the sounds of a vocalist, and then I use the computer to transform it. And maybe I'll perform, if we can turn the lights on, I'll perform the first couple minutes of this piece and just get an idea about this, what this looks like. And there's a performance of me and many others on YouTube on my Vimeo channel. Go ahead. Thank you, Darren. So I'll just do a little bit of this and you can see what it's like. And you get an idea of the there. Sorry, we've only got one channel here, so anyway, that was a special one channel version, special River Falls debut of the one channel version. Yeah, the lights on. Thank you for that. I'm thinking about, as our players in a piece that you'll hear Saturday night called Gone Dog Gone, this whole appendix of gestures that I've, with these really lavishly explained definitions of these various hand gestures. There's some 120 or so in the piece of Asia. And then I'm desperately trying to remember what happens next as I do these hand gestures while I'm playing. So that's a little bit about that. That is a very specific, determinate kind of approach. There's right and wrong, and I did some wrong just now. I just want to say. Okay, so it's been a long time since you showed us some jazz piano. Can we have some more music that sounds like music? I mean, would it really kill you to write a string quartet or maybe a pop song? So I thought I would just share a little bit of that side. Here's just a movement from a 20 movement piece for string quartet. This is the St. Lawrence String Quartet. Let's see if we can get the stereo a total of 2 pop songs in my life. This is a very recent enterprise. A couple summers ago, with a friend of mine, Johan Becker, who and his friend Frederick Tomander were visiting. They're from Sweden, where a lot of American pop songs have been written for the last 15 or so years. I don't know if you know that. I mean, like a huge amount of top 40. By the way, when I say pop song, when you meet like a professor at some august institution who's a composer who says that they're writing pop music, they usually mean one of 3 things. Either they want to be Radiohead, or they're playing in some sort of Grateful Dead or Fish-like jam band, or they're playing bluegrass. I'm not sure what. Anyway, but like I mean, when I say I wrote 2 pop songs, like this is like attempting to be top 40. Like there's a rule book, and I'm trying to follow the rule book, which my grad students said is like the most experimental thing that I could do, which is a kind of weird irony. In any case, when I was in, not far from here at Carleton College as an undergraduate in the late 80s, I met this guy, Johan Becker, who now looks like this. So this is my friend who's like a famous Swedish pop star. And so I wrote a song with him when he and his friend Frederick were in town, and they were visiting my rock history class at Stanford University. I said, hey, I've never tried to write like a really mainstream pop song. Can I? And so we wrote this song together. So what I'm going to share with you is this song. It's just a demo, and it may not do anything, but the whole fun was to try to commune with this set of cultural norms. And so the piece is called Back Off Bitch. The hook is it's like an angry breakup. It's a heteronormative thing, but it's from the woman's perspective, so the guy is the bitch. So that's kind of the hook I thought was sort of fun. And I came up first with this kind of electric guitar riff, and then the chord progression, and then I wrote most of the lyrics. I wrote none of the melody, and this is a singer, a Swedish singer, who sounds American to me, singing. And oh, you're supposed to imagine, have somebody in mind, so I had Terry Pink in mind. That's sort of the model, like kind of tough chick sort of thing. So here's a little bit of back off pitch. So more contrasts. Have you noticed there are a lot of contrasts today? That's what I'm hoping to suggest, if not dilettantism. Okay, this brings us now to ABBA. Not that ABBA. The form, ABBA. So first I shared some jazz with you, and then I showed the Musketeer. We had a tour of sort of experimental pieces, and then I shared this misguided pop music enterprise. And so I'm actually dividing these into sort of two types, and we can sort of sequence them here. So on the bottom we have what I guess we could call vernacular music, right? Sort of the pop and the jazz sort of things. But I actually want to rename that, call that consumption. And there's a reason for this that I'm going to reveal later. Whereas at the top we have what might be called non-vernacular enterprise, or really what I think of as experimentation. By the way, the string quartet that you heard, to the person, the common man on the street, that kind of writing, that kind of music is definitely esoteric, and definitely, and I agree, it's non-vernacular. So you'd think it would go with the experimentation. I don't put it with the experimentation at all. There's nothing experimental about that. That was a piece whose aesthetic is a well-known, if somewhat more recent than Haydn, kind of aesthetic. That's undoubtedly in the consumption side. So it actually belongs with the practice of playing a 12-bar blues. It belongs with the practice of writing a pop song in a top 40 video, okay? Anyway, so we have these two things, and here's the crisis. I promised you a crisis, and I chose clip art from my PowerPoint thing. I thought the woman gesturing like this and the baby crying. And I'm not sure why, but somehow the dental tools suggested crisis to me. Anyway, so I put them there. So the crisis is that these things have a certain kind of moral valence to me. So experimentation, to me, is a genuine contribution to a discourse, a feeling that if I don't make these works, no one will. And on the consumption side, we have creativity as guilty pleasure. The world is already lousy with this kind of art. There's plenty of other composers who have more faith and fealty and probably prowess than I in these kinds of idioms. In experimentation, we find the risk of failure. Moreover, an inability to assess success. Was that a good doorstop articulation or not? On the consumption side, the pleasure and cachet of communing with functional or proven culture. On the experimentation side, we find a kind of marginal expression. I am misunderstood, or way more often just simply ignored. And on the consumption side, a mainstream expression, I am understood. In the experimentation, I mean the personal invented discipline in service of, quote, progress or iconoclasm. And on the consumption side, traditional discipline in service of conservation, or maybe what we call yeoman evolution. So the dilemma for me is that I started to associate these things with giving and taking. And I realize that it's exactly the inverse. This is my perspective, folks. And I'm not putting this on any other composer. This is just the crisis that I've sort of been feeling of late. And so, part of the crisis is if we cross out experimentation, we change this word instead to philanthropy, then you find a couple other kinds of, and my friend Rob Reich, who writes on philanthropy, has this idea of philanthropy as distinguished from consumption. Philanthropy characterized by altruism, which may be guided by an aspiration of moral decency, actually often characterized by sacrifice, and maybe in a pithy, if somewhat garish way, I could say, use the quote, well, I don't need a second kidney, right? I mean, especially compared to people who don't have a single working kidney. Why is it that I should have two? I really only need one. And on the consumption side, leisure and recreation motivated by hedonism, enterprise often characterized by self-interest, self-indulgent, and this could be characterized maybe by a very different statement. Well, you know, I would enjoy a second flat-screen television. Okay, so in this huge continuum between I don't need, I could elect to give away one of my kidneys and I could choose to maybe buy another flat-screen television today, I'm struggling with some sort of ideal place among them. Where should I be on that? In terms of time, how much of my time do I have for others? And of course, how much of my time do I have for myself? So, you know, you have this kind of like notion of like self-interest and the interest of others. So this essentially boils down to a not me and me dichotomy, and I'm attempting to harmonize these things unsuccessfully, I'll point out. But the crisis is that I'm trying to figure out where on all of these sorts of places I fit. What does a decent, good life consist of in terms of doing things for me and doing things for others? And my point in all of this, and this is where the crisis is in a talk that's about an artist talk, is that that has mapped onto this division that I have made. It's a false dichotomy. It's a concept in my head. It's not real, I understand, but it's real for me. That this division that I've made between the experimental impulse, which I've identified with philanthropy in a sense, and the consumptive impulse, which I identify, you know, with this other kind of more hedonic side. Okay, so here's a map of musical culture. It's an excerpt. It's not to scale. So here's a space. Can you see this? It's lit up in blue. What is that space? Those are pieces with lyrical melodies. Okay, and so I ask, are there any examples? And then we say, yeah, a lot. There are tons of pieces with lyrical melodies. We probably don't need any more. Well, at least not from you. I mean, you don't even really care about lyrical melodies. So I imagine this space as like, if you imagine this as a flat space of all musical culture as like some sort of checkerboard, and then there's a square where we're going to put all the pieces of music that are interested in lyrical melodies, we're going to stack them up. And I go and I look at that, and that space, and I think, there's like dozens of pieces already that do that. Or maybe more than dozens, like millions of pieces, right? And then I look over here, what's this? Well, these are pieces about syncopation. Yeah, it turns out there's a whole bunch of those already. And here's pieces with quarter tones. Here's solo, violin, extended technique, spectral harmonies. Maybe not as many in the spectral harmony thing as the lyrical melody thing, but still a whole lot. Conceptually, I mean, it might as well be an infinity for me. Because I notice these places, all these spots seem to be filled up on this side of my culture map. But then I look over here and I say, what's that space? It turns out those are pieces for florist and orchestra. Okay? And I ask the question, is there anything in that spot? And I figured, that's an empty space. And I seem to have noticed it. This is like horribly colonial, by the way. It's like finding your own island or something and extracting all of this wealth. But the point, and by the way, that's an empty space, and there's probably a good reason why it's empty, okay? But I feel like it's a dirty job, but you are the composer for it. And by dirty job, I mean artistically dubious, culturally ignorable, and critically opaque. So I'm not saying that anyone else should be attracted to that space other than me, but the point is I identify something authentic about, I'm constructed in such a way to look for and enjoy those kinds of spaces that are less familiar, less worn out, as it were. The Branford Marsalis said this great thing about the problem with a lot of students. He says, he's addressing students, it's like, you don't know what you like. You like what you know. Okay, so one of the big problems, of course, is exposure. You need to expose. I have almost an inverted problem. It's almost like if I know it, I almost automatically don't like it. And if I don't know about it, then there's some virtue in that. I don't think that's a good thing, but that's how I'm constructed. Okay. So what about this spot? Oh, these are pieces for three conductors and no players. And over here we find pieces with wristwatch notations. And here we have instruments made of junk. And here are pieces that I recently wrote, pieces that generate their own score. So the project for me is about finding these other kinds of spaces and operating on this side of the line. Whereas this side, you know, there's just a lot of other people. I just don't feel like useful really working on that side of the line. I can come to think of this as like good, quote, good I can do versus hedonism I can't enjoy. Now look, over here, this is say 12 bar blues. I'm going to do a bunch of that tonight. I'm not saying I can't be on this side, and I'm going to enjoy it. Right? But I do feel that it's a kind of guilty pleasure. And over here, I recognize that this is just the inverse of what most people think. I mean, most people would say, like, this is not on most people's radar. And when it gets on their radar, they try to figure out how to get it back off their radar. Okay? So I understand that this side, and I'm not saying good I can do in the sense, I'm not saying that my Concerta for Florist is well done, is a good piece. And I'm not saying that it's important to anyone else or that anyone other than my mother is going to notice it. I'm just saying that, like, in the construction that I've made in terms of how I feel I can make a life in art and contribute in some way, this side has turned out to be the good side, and the other side isn't the evil side. It's just the consumptive side. It's just for me. And again, for another composer, writing a lyrical melody might be an experimental impulse. Okay, so Charles asks, what about hammers? Remember those? So we have hammers. Well, Maslow's law basically tells us that to a man who has only a hammer, all the world looks like a nail. This is not intrinsically, I think, a rich creative context in order to have agency creatively and explore your imagination. So I think the goal is to have a lot of different tools, to cultivate a lot of different tools. And that fits with this impulse of mine to do a lot of different contrasting, diverse things, to work on a piano, to invent my own instrument, even at the point of being lonely, right? To do all these different things, to work with florists, but also to play AABA 32-bar song forms on pieces of melodies of other composers, like we're going to do tonight, okay? So for me, it's about cultivating a whole bunch of tools. And that's where I'm at, trying to pursue a lot of these tools. And the meta tools are these two sides of this yin-yang that I propose. So trying to harmonize these enterprises at the same time, making sure that I, in a sense, nourish them. And with that, I thank you for your patience. That's a wrap. I see there's 2 minutes left. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. In that case, then thank you for your patience and for so many of you who are playing on some of my music for your artistry. And I'll look forward to hopefully seeing you at subsequent rehearsals in the coming days and in our concerts tonight and Saturday night. Yeah, thanks again, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for your generosity.